Good morning, family. How you doing, Brandon? When do you head for basic? Good. We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 today. So, today we're going to talk about head coverings. Seems pointless sometimes to talk about. It's not something we practice in the Church of Christ in general. But there's some important things found in this passage. First of all, anytime we hold that something's true, we ought to be able to tell people why, right? Part of that whole defending the faith, dividing the Word of God, all of this. So we need to be able to explain this passage. And to be honest, most people, they accept an answer and they don't ever actually look at the passage. And you know this by who struggles with it and who doesn't. Because if you don't struggle with this, you probably never really looked at how he says it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, he says, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head." Okay. So the first question we ought to be asking is, what's the difference? In a world where equality or gender equality was less of an issue, this might not have been a question that occurred to us. But it occurs to me, why the difference in expectation? Why is the man expected, why is it obligated that he has his head uncovered, and the woman is obligated to have her head covered? It's not it's not a matter of submission, it can't be. Because who's the head of the man? Christ. Who's the head of Christ? God. So he's not at the top either. So what's the difference? He's going to go into this in verse 8. And this explanation to us probably is not going to sound very satisfactory, but it's the explanation he gives. He says, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman." So, he's going to go into contradicting himself here in a second. But how many of you felt like that was a satisfying answer? Why does the woman have to have her head covered? Well, because she was made from man. What? Like, you see what I'm saying? If you have not struggled with this passage, you probably have not studied this passage. Because in our worldview, this makes no sense. Right? I cannot explain what he just said within the confines of our societal and cultural beliefs. Because in our society, this does not make sense. Okay? Any preacher or anyone who gets up and tries to teach and saying they can make this make sense in our world, in our context, is wrong. Because it doesn't. But what I can tell you is that his point in this passage is not addressing head coverings. the point he's at and the point he's about to make is addressing who is greater, the man or the woman. And he's addressing this issue through the context of a tradition that this particular culture practiced. Does that make sense? So let's read on. Verse 12, for as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Well, why ask the question? Didn't he just tell us no? Right? He says, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So that means long hair on a man is sin? Was it ever a sin? Depends on who you ask, I guess. If you ask my barber from growing up, George, he would have told you yes. You know, he's the guy you went and said, hey, I need the dead ends cut off, and he'd cut you down to about an inch. And he was firm believer if your hair could not be made into a flat top, it was far, far too long, right? So cultural beliefs changes, and it wasn't that long ago that, yeah, we would have considered a man with long hair that's at best a hippie, right? There was a time where Sam would have been called a hippie. Probably were called a hippie, weren't you? So in this, there's got to be a point that he's making, right? And it's got to be more than just this head covering thing, because he dedicates a lot of words to this issue, right? I mean, you think about it. I ask, does a woman need to have her head covered when she prays? What's the answer? Yes or no, depending on how you see the issue, right? It's a one-word answer. So why do we have 16 verses dedicated to answering the question? If you're wondering why I keep asking questions and not giving answers, there's a point to it all. He says, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. All right? That's his answer to the whole thing. So what's he doing? He's affirming a culturally held belief. This entire passage, right? He's explaining a culturally held belief, right? That women must have their head covered, men cannot have their heads covered. That isn't doctrine, that's culture. And he's explaining it because obviously in this church, in this group of people, there is some issues. People are not understanding it. You have people that are holding to it, and you have people that are not holding to it and don't understand why they're being told to. So what's he doing? He's explaining that thought process. And then he's saying, and if you have a hard time with this, understand this is not a Bible issue. This is not a God issue. We have no such held beliefs. So what's the conclusion in all of this? Do women have to have their heads covered? Well, you think about all the things that he's covered throughout this entire letter thus far. And I think you'll find that the answer is a lot more gray than a yes or no. Because as we've talked about before, and I'm glad to bring up again now that Sarah's in the audience again. If I remember correctly, you were the one that had an issue with this last time. Women have the right to not wear head coverings, right? I mean, that's the easy conclusion from Paul's statement right at the end of it. We have no such practices. What does that mean? No. That's the easy answer. So it's your right to have your head uncovered. Except, as we've talked about over and over and over again, just because you have the right to something does not make it the right thing to do. So what happens if you go and visit a church where all the women have their heads covered? What should you do? Probably cover your head, right? Because otherwise, you have people there that are viewing you as disobedient to God. Does it actually offend God? No. But you are at that point, and this is a really tough word, because we have some really horrible views of it. At that point, you are being immodest. Does that make sense? We think of modesty, and we always talk about women's clothing when we talk about modesty, and it's a part of it, right? But what's the what does it mean? What's the line for dressing immodestly? Well, there's a time where showing your ankles was enough, right? There was a time showing your ankles would have gotten you called a harlot. Then it was, well, just try not to show your collarbone. In our world where modesty's gone out the window, I'm pretty happy if you're wearing something, you know? Like, so what does modesty actually mean? Because it's tough. We don't like this area of subjectivity, because that means it's up to you to tell me whether I'm sinning or not. And the answer is yes. That's exactly what it is, whether we like it or not. So if we're at a church where it is accepted practice and expected practice that men come to church dressed in suits, and you know this, and you come in dressed in t-shirt and blue jeans, you are dressed immodestly. Now, understand, before anyone gets on their high horse and offended, I'm not telling you that you have to wear a suit in church. I am the last person that's going to tell you that. What I am telling you is if the church itself holds to that practice and you come in willingly, dressing different, you're being immodest. Likewise, if you go to a church where no one dresses up, right? I go in and every man there is dressed in coveralls and flannel, and I come in my three-piece, I am dressed immodestly. Right? If you go into a church where women wear dresses and you go in wearing a pantsuit, you're dressed immodestly. If you go to a church where people don't wear jewelry and you put on 15 necklaces, bracelets, earrings, the whole 9 yards, you're dressed immodestly. Immodesty is a purely culturally defined construct. God instructs us to obey those constructs. He tells us to be modest in our appearance. Why? For the same reason he's urging people to go along with this head covering for the business. It isn't about you. It's never been about you. You don't come to church drawing attention to yourself, trying to make it about you, because it's not about you. The entire point of us being here is to encourage one another in faith, to worship God together. And we worship God together in order to encourage one another. How am I encouraged by the worship of God with my fellow saints if I can't stop looking at somebody else? And that's really what it boils down to. Stop making yourself the centerpiece. And immodesty can look a lot like dressing too nicely, just as easily as it can look like not dressing nice enough. It can look like wearing too much clothes or not enough. We think of immodesty and we think of conservative. It's not. Modesty, moderation. You dress in the middle, like the average. That's what it means. right? Just like it would be immodest if we're in the middle of summer and you come in here wearing a parka during services. That's immodest. You're drawing a lot of attention to yourself because we're all going to be sitting there on pins and needles waiting for you to pass out in the church and wondering who's going to call 911, right? So this is why he argues for the head coverings. You need to go ahead, go along with this. This is why they believe in this. This is why they practice it. Go ahead and do this. Understand, this is not a doctrinal issue. We don't actually subscribe to this thought process. But this is what they practice, so go ahead and do that. Does that make sense? Now, we just had the whole conversation where he says, I have become all things to all people. This is a continuation of that conversation. He's showing us over and over again in this letter, do not make this about yourself. You need to understand how to put yourself last. So, the thing is, we have people, even within churches of Christ, on both sides of this issue, right? There are still churches of Christ that maintain this women should have their heads covered thing. To be honest, it's hard to get there while reading the actual passage about head coverings when he concludes the entire statement of the churches of God have no such beliefs. But they get there. Sometimes we're so concerned about being right and telling everyone how right we are and correcting people when they're wrong because, it would be un-American and un-Christ-like for us to allow you to continue being wrong, right? Everything must be corrected. But there's a certain level of arrogance in it. That not only do I know the best way, but because I know the best way, it's the only way. We ought to be careful that we don't draw the hard lines unless God draws the hard line. If we're seeking to be mature Christians, we need to be the people to understand what can be moved, what can be allowed, what can be endured with love. But you look around here and you think modesty really isn't an issue, and it isn't. This is one of the few churches that I don't actually ever have thought of modesty as being an issue. Because we have people dressed in suits, we have people wearing ties, and we have people wearing t-shirts and blue jeans. There is no rule of modesty. And I think that's exactly where it ought to be. But how do you assess the people who don't think of it that way? What would you say if you went and visited a congregation where every man wore a suit and they came down hard on you because you weren't? Would you judge them? Would you think of them as not real Christians? Maybe not mature Christians, certainly not loving Christians, right? The compassion part has to come into play. That understanding that these also are people trying to obey and please God, whether we agree with how they're doing it or not. And not drawing the hard lines means not being offended when other people do. Does that make sense? So, I want to continue on. We're going to stop here pretty soon because I don't want to get in the Lord's Supper. That deserves its own lesson. But in verse 17 he says, "But in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together it is not for the better, but for the worse." So, he's addressing an issue in the church, differences, but he's actually telling them what a good job they're doing. We would call this encouragement. And not a be patted on the back kind of encouragement, but this is what is expected of you. This is what needs to happen kind of encouragement. Now we're going to get into the Lord's Supper, and we're going to do that next week. But I really, really hope that some of you, if not all of you, take some time and read this. It's not very long. Literally just from verse 18 through 34, through the rest of the chapter. Take time this next week. I don't care if it's an hour. If you have more time than that, take it. If you only have, if you can just give it 10 minutes just to read it, take some time on it, because we're going to challenge some commonly held thoughts on the Lord's Supper. And because that is such a pivotal issue within our congregation, within the church at large, it's very important to me that you come to the table with some background on what this passage is going to say. Otherwise, I'm trying to teach you about something you're not even looking at. And I can do that sometimes, but generally, when we're in it together, it's a lot easier to come to the same conclusions and come to an agreement, or at least an understanding, right? So, take some time, look at it. It is important, right? We can brush off the whole head coverings thing as a non-issue, all we want to. And to some extent, I'm okay with that. You can't do that with the Lord's Supper. It's important for us to know why we do it. It's important for us to know what the Bible says is acceptable about it. It's also important to understand why we do it the way we do it. And it should lead us to the conclusion that maybe the way we do it isn't the only way it has to be done. This morning we make offer to any of you who are in need for reconciliation, whether that's with each other, or whether that's with the church, or whether that's to God himself. Whatever your needs are this morning, if you have need to make confession, to enter into that state of repentance, to be washed clean in the waters of baptism, to receive the forgiveness of God. If you're seeking reconciliation today, please bring those needs forward. Make them known so we can help you see them as we stand and sing.